Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the IISS Middle East Center. Some of you have been here before, but I do see many new faces, so let me take a couple of minutes telling you what we try to do here, and then invite our panel to speak on the subject this evening. The IISS set up first of all, the IISS came to Bahrain as the host of the Manama Dialogue. And over time, the Manama Dialogue has become the most important gathering of security and defense officials in this region and from among the major powers around the world. But a few years ago, thanks to an initiative from the Economic Development Board of Bahrain and the government of Bahrain, the IISS has had the opportunity to host the Geoeconomics and Strategy program here in the Bahrain office. The program began with an international conference on the impact of the 2008-2009 transatlantic financial crisis on geopolitics, on power relations around the world, the slow shift of the locus of growth from the west to the east, and the implications of all of that for the Gulf region. Following that, we established this program, and we've had several conferences. Some of you have attended some of these conferences. We've had a very successful conference, in fact, on the subject of this evening's discussion, which is the relationship between a changing Asia, particularly East Asia, and the Gulf, with the growth of China, Japan, Korea, India, Southeast Asia, and the impact of that on the Gulf region. We've had an interesting conference on currency wars, the rise of the renminbi and the challenge to the dollar and the euro. We had an interesting conference on political risk and its impact on financial risk and economic risk. And more recently, we had a conference on Africa's rise. And again, a session was devoted to the implications of Africa's rise for the Gulf investors and Gulf businesses. The whole purpose of the geoeconomics program is to relate global economic trends to global geopolitical trends. Our next conference, in fact, is we are planning to look at the impact of the fiscal crisis in many countries around the world, but particularly in the US with the fiscal cliff and the sequestration, and the debt crisis in Europe, and the impact of that on defense spending, and what does that mean for regional security, whether in Middle East or in Indian Ocean region, or in East Asia or in South China Sea, and so on and so forth. So again, relating economic trends to geopolitics and security. As part of this program, we've had a series of lectures on some of these themes. In fact, some of you were here when Dr. Mohammed Al-Saban came and spoke here on the changes in the market for energy, a very successful lecture program some months ago. This evening, we have three distinguished speakers. We have, of course, Dr. Mohammed Al-Saban, and I'm sure I don't have to introduce him to a Bahraini audience, but let me just mention that he has a master's degree in economics from the University of California and a PhD in economics from the University of Colorado. He's been a professor of economics at the King Abdulaziz University, a part-time advisor to the Minister of Petroleum, and since 1997, he's senior economic advisor to the Minister of Petroleum and Mineral Resources. He has led the Saudi delegation and served as chief negotiator to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, and he has participated in many OPEC meetings, so he's an authority on the subject. Our second speaker is from Bahrain, Sheikh Mohammed bin Khalifa bin Ahmed Al Khalifa, who has been directly responsible for the projects of Noga Holdings, a subsidiary of the National Oil and Gas Authority of Bahrain. He's been a member of the National Oil and Gas Authority since 2009, a director of the Technical Services Department in the Ministry of Finance, and a member of the board of directors of several government institutions and oil and industrial companies. Our third speaker is my colleague from our office in Singapore, Dr. Pierre Noël. He is the Sultan Hassan Al Bolkiah Senior Fellow for Economic and Energy Security based at the IISS Asia office in Singapore. Dr. Noel is responsible for research in international energy markets, oil and gas, and the intersection between energy and foreign policy. He has been earlier with the Judge Business School at the University of Cambridge. He has a PhD from Sciences Po Grenoble, and he was a research fellow at IFRI in Paris and a senior policy fellow at the European Council of Foreign Relations. He has published extensively on the subject. So we really have three distinguished speakers, authorities on the subject. And I'm going to basically ask them one question and leave it at that. I'll invite them to speak for 10, 15 minutes. We have time. And then take questions from you to which they will answer. We see both a change on the supply side in the energy markets with the growth of new sources of energy, particularly natural gas, shale gas, and oil. Most importantly, the United States has emerged as an important source of energy. Its import demand has sharply come down. On the other side, we also see we have seen for some time now structural change on the demand side with the rise of Asian economies and other emerging economies. So both the supply side of oil and natural gas and the demand side have seen major structural shifts. Quite clearly, that would impact on the Gulf region, the economics of the Gulf region, as well as the security, geopolitics, and international relations of the region with the rest of the world. The region, of course, has its own domestic challenges. I'm not sure if we will get into those issues, particularly the regional security issues with Iran and Israel and the consequences of the changes in the Arab world. But setting those issues aside, the sheer geopolitics of managing the structural changes on the supply side and on the demand side is a challenge for the region. And I'll invite all the three speakers to reflect on these issues and feel free to focus on what they regard are the future challenges, because many of you are you're a well-informed audience. Rather than devote too much time to what has happened, I think it'll be interesting to try and understand from them what they see are the likely future trends. So without any further imposition on your time, I will invite first Dr. Al-Saban to make the initial remarks, and then I'll invite Sheikh Mohammed, and then finally my colleague Pierre.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Let me first start by thanking the Institute, IISS Institute, for inviting me for the second time. I hope I can bring something new from what I had first time. But the topic that we have before us today is very challenging, and Saudi Arabia, along with the other GCC countries, are facing huge challenges these days because of the changes in the world energy markets. We all know that as our chairman said, on the demand side, since 2008, there has been a peak in the demand for oil in the OECD countries. And since then, demand for oil in these countries have started to decline, even though it was masked by the economic crisis. But definitely, the OECD demand for oil is declining. The only reason that we see that there is a growth in the demand for oil worldwide is basically because of the high growth rate of demand for oil from the emerging economies, particularly China, India, and Brazil. But even those countries are not repeating what industrialized countries used to do as far as the energy use. They are trying to be more efficient in their energy use, and they are trying to use other energy sources in order to reduce, if they are a net importing country, in order to reduce the importing bill for them, oil bill. We expect that demand will continue to increase at a very slow rate However, by 2020, as many statistics and many forecasts indicating, we will see demand for oil will peak. And that is very challenging for oil producers, in particular OPEC countries, who are the swing producer and who will have to shoulder more burden than other countries. So this is on the demand side. Definitely on the demand side, there is gradual displacement of oil by using the natural gas, electric cars, et cetera, et cetera. We all know that the public transportation in many, if not all, OECD countries are run by either electricity or natural gas. We have seen also the use of the biofuel in the transportation sector. So a lot of structural changes in the on the demand side that is of a lasting effect. Even if prices go down, these are not reversible. It is not the same as what happened in the 80s, when we have seen the prices dropped and then we have seen demand picking up again. I think with the increasing building of the infrastructure of different sources of energy, the tougher regulations, standards with regard to the CAFE standard, etc., as far as the fuel efficiency, I think this will impact permanently the demand for oil in not only in OECD countries, but all over the world. On the supply side, we have seen also structural change. And these changes have started to affect the supply side. Just 5 years ago, nobody was talking about shale oil and shale gas. Now we have seen that the United States is a major producer of shale oil and shale gas. We have seen other countries who have never been on the map to be a producer of hydrocarbon. We have seen Argentina that is to start producing shale gas, Australia, and many other countries, UK, many other countries who are going to be major producers, even Saudi Arabia. As a matter of fact, our last estimate is that we will, we have about 660 trillion cubic feet of unconventional gas. That is shale oil, shale gas. So I think even though it is coming gradual, and even though the increase in supply of non-conventional gas and oil is not coming all at the same time, we see that it is a matter of time that they will have a major impact on the demand for oil, a major impact on the oil market, and definitely a major impact on the countries like Saudi Arabia, who have huge oil reserves and huge oil exports. So I think from now on, Saudi Arabia and other GCC countries started to look at the problem very seriously. We think that things cannot go business as usual, and efforts to diversify our economies need to be intensified, need to be speeding somehow in order to reduce our dependency on oil revenues before the world reduces its dependency on oil. So this is the fact that every policymaker in Saudi Arabia is recognizing, and we are trying to make every effort in order to achieve this reduction of dependency in oil revenues. Of course, we are facing too many challenges. The main challenge that we are facing is the domestic consumption of oil. We are consuming around 4 million barrels of oil equivalent, and that is huge amount. Per capita consumption of fuel is among the highest, if not the highest, well, only second to Venezuela. And of course, we are developing our economies. We are urbanizing different areas. Population is growing, but that doesn't justify that we have a 7% annual increase in the consumption of oil equivalent. And the main reason, of course, as we all know, is because of the subsidized prices. And not only that, but also because of the lack of public transportation in Saudi Arabia. These two issues, which is having the major effect on the increasing consumption of oil domestically, have been carefully addressed these days. The issue of subsidies is very sensitive. The government is trying to see ways and means and benefit from the good practices in order to see how to phase out the subsidies. Also, the government is building the public transportation, trains, buses, etc., etc. And I think if we solve these, along with the energy efficiency measures that needs to be put in place, standards, etc., green buildings, I think that will solve or reduce somehow the demand for energy domestically. Also on the supply side, Saudi Arabia is thinking seriously, not only thinking, we are embarking on developing solar energy. And even though the political decision for developing nuclear is there, however, we are giving priority to solar energy, along with the recent discoveries of conventional and non-conventional gas in Saudi Arabia. And there is a decision by the government now that all power generation sector and desalination should be using gas, whether conventional or non-conventional. Non-conventional gas will not come on stream before 2 years from now, but it is going to come on stream very soon, 2 or 3 years. Conventional gas, there are new discoveries, and our total reserve have topped about 300 trillion cubic feet, and that is very comfortable. We can meet the demand for gas for industry. Phasing out subsidies is a very sensitive issue, as I said, because it is going to affect the low-income people, and therefore the Saudi government is planning to see how to compensate and how those low-income people would not face a problem by phasing out the subsidies. Also, the subsidy for the gas, natural gas, which is now being sold by at around 75 cents for million BTU. I think this will be revised, but also the government is totally aware that any new prices should not affect the competitiveness of the Saudi petrochemicals in particular, but also other industries. And all of these issues being looked at, and now Saudi Arabia is going to be addressing them very carefully, but we cannot afford to continue business as usual the amount of subsidy, domestic subsidy for fuel is around 162 billion riyals, around $45 billion. And that is huge money, a lot of money. And maybe, of course, now Saudi Arabia can afford it because of high revenues, but definitely over time, this will be a burden. So it is better to start up taking tough decisions now rather than shelving these decisions and pay higher prices at the later stage. For the whole region, I think we need to prepare for the new age of energy. And I think this is very important. Diversification is going on, as I said, and there is relative or different levels of success among GCC countries, but definitely for Saudi Arabia, as I said, we need to do more. For Saudi Arabia, I think going the path of knowledge economy, knowledge-based economy, is very crucial. We have started implementing strategy of transforming Saudi Arabia into a knowledge-based society, and by concentrating on education, trying to increase the quality of education in Saudi Arabia, and try to do like the South Korean and others who do not have natural resource base, but they succeeded in developing their economies by adopting the knowledge-based economies. I don't want to take longer, but I think this is a general view. Definitely there will be some questions and answers with regard to this. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Al-Zaban. I think it's very interesting that apart from the kind of issues that I flagged, you focused actually on a very important issue, which is the challenges that governments in the region face at home, and the importance of dealing with oil subsidies, the local demand for oil, and with a post-oil economy. So I can see that the challenges are not just international, but also probably even more importantly, local, and that is the challenge for most of the countries in the region. Let me now invite Sheikh Mohammed bin Khalifa bin Ahmed Al Khalifa.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sanjaya, and good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It is my pleasure to be here with you. I will start by agreeing with what Dr. Al-Zaban has said, that there is a potential demand is peaked, and the market is facing a potential risk in growth prospects of demand and maybe an oversupply because of the shale revolution in the US. But I also believe in the flip side. I think this might tell you that it's not as clear-cut as we expect. I think if we had a crystal ball, it's not going to be that clear. The flip side is that there potentially could also be supply constraints. If we look at demand growth, with the information revolution, everybody aspires to live the lifestyle of the West. If you look at the populations of India and China, want to be consumers like their Western counterparts, and hence the very high growth rates you see there. It might continue for a while. And although Europe is facing economic hardship, it will not last forever. The supply constraint, if you remember, the US peaked in its oil production at, I think, in the late 70s at 12 million barrels. Then they dropped to 5 million barrels. So assuming that current production will maintain itself, conventional oil production is also not entirely true. And what if the rest of the world faces what the US faced back in the 70s? Now, production has since grown back to around 7 million barrels per day in the US, but I don't think that they will reach the 12 million target anytime soon. The shale concept is an entirely different science to conventional oil. When you drill a well in an unconventional field, it survives for a number of years and then it shuts down. You have to drill another one. Unlike the conventional side where it continues producing for many years. Last year, I had the privilege of going to Moscow, where I met the president of Lukoil, and he was telling me that they have oil wells that only produce 1 barrel a day, and they still keep it operational. The concept of peaking production is still a reality. It is possible. Although shale has added a new avenue, there could be supply constraints. So there is a flip side. And demand could continue to grow. If you look at the growth in our part of the world, where the majority of the world crude reserves are, and gas, it has the highest population growth, and with it the highest demand growth of energy. So as the years go by, the demand for consuming a lot of those hydrocarbons that are now exported is going to increase. And if Saudi Arabia continues using crude to produce energy, they will continue consuming more barrels, maybe up to eventually 5 million barrels. Hopefully with the shale gas concept, if that's successful, they can reverse those options. So it is not that clear cut what will happen in the future. I mean, there are issues supporting the view that Dr. Sabban has put forward, and I agree with it, but I believe there is also enough to support the flip side. The increase in demand might not be really supported with an excess supply of crude. As far as Bahrain is concerned, we're dependent on our indigenous production of natural gas for producing electricity and water. It's a finite reserve. We're comfortable with supplying our current demand profile, but there is a lot of requests for extra supply, especially in expanding industry, but also for electricity and water. So for Bahrain, we've embarked on a similar program to what the rest of the Gulf is doing, which is looking at deep gas, similar to shale gas. We've a year and a half ago signed a concession with Occidental to drill a deep gas well here in Bahrain. We're hopeful that there is gas. The challenge is how much will it cost to extract. Now in the tight gas field, I think the Omanis are probably at the forefront. They have already drilled 17 tight gas wells. BP has committed to invest around $15 billion in producing deep gas in Oman. And I think hopefully the results will be positive and the costs will be controlled. If that is replicated in Saudi Arabia will be able to produce its domestic needs of energy from its shale gas. They're very hopeful. And inshallah, Bahrain could also follow that lead, with a much smaller land footprint, but I think our demand is also much smaller than theirs. Just to give you an indication of what shale is, this is a little bit of geology for you. We all know that hydrocarbon comes from organic material that was deposited in the earth millions of years ago, and as there's sedimentation over it, it reaches a certain temperature and pressure, it begins to cook. And those organic materials, when they start cooking, they produce oil, and oil flows to the top. So when it finds the right structure, it fills up that structure and becomes an oil field. If it gets hotter, that hydrocarbon converts to gas. The region we are in has the most prolific oil and gas fields anywhere. The Ghawar field is the largest oil field in the world, and Saudi Arabia, Burgan is the second largest. Qatar has the north field, which is shared with Iran. Iranians call it the South Pars. These are the largest oil and gas fields. Now, they came from some source rock material, and that source rock material should be everywhere. And hopefully, if there is still some organic material left, you should have the same revolution as the US had. That's the theory. Whether it happens or not, I think will be proven in the next 2 or 3 years. So I think that is something to be ambitious for. We're very excited with the prospects of investing in refining. Saudi Arabia has done an amazing job in attracting investments in refineries and petrochemicals. They have the single largest petrochemical complex being completed with Dow Chemical. Abu Dhabi is embarking on the same. They're increasing their production of urea, a byproduct of gas that is used globally for the production of food. So I think we are doing our part to supply the world's energy needs, fertilizer needs, petrochemical needs, and everybody's looking at the continuous increase in demand from both China and India, hopefully, giving Europe time to recover. But there could be a rosier picture out there than the current economic turmoil. Hopefully it will be short-lived. I mean, that's my 10-minute or less comments. So thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thank you. I think it's useful to have a different perspective, and I'm sure we'd have questions. Pierre?
Thank you very much, Sanjaya, and thank you everyone for being here. It's a real pleasure for me to be back to this office. Last time I was here, almost exactly a month ago, there was an earthquake. So hopefully, hopefully Boucher will keep quiet for the next 45 minutes or whatever we spend in this room. No slides. No, you can't change the rules ex post. I was told I could have slides. I spent too much time in a business school, perhaps, that now I can't speak without slides. So you will have to endure my slides. It's very interesting because the two views that have been developed by the two previous speakers are both present in my comments in my presentation as two possibilities, and it's very interesting that we actually without consulting ourselves, we actually divided the roles like that. The pessimist, the optimist, and the academic who will be both pessimist and optimistic at the same time. So I don't know the future, but I know the past, which is the only thing we can have knowledge about if we spend enough time working on it. And knowing the past is very useful because it helps you identify the right questions for the future. And that's what I'm going to do here. So that I'm going to skip. The Gulf, the Middle East oil exporters now export roughly what they did export, just a bit less that they did export in 1973. At the time of what we call the first oil shock. But of course, I mean, in terms of market share, it's also interesting to see that they've been losing market share slowly but consistently over the past 20 years. But of course, it's not market shares of volumes that matter. It's the money you get from those. And that leads me to the next slide, which is very complicated, but I'll take a bit of time because I think it's very rich. The metric on the right-hand side gives you roughly the annual export revenues for the countries of this region, and each dot on the graph corresponds to a level of exports and a price of oil at the time. Each dot is a year, and you see this sort of snail being being drawn by history. And the message is, in the early 70s, those countries, and OPEC countries in general, but especially Middle East countries, engineered some sort of a shortage by triggering major institutional change, nationalizing historical oil concessions, and basically abruptly stopping the massive program of investment in the lowest cost oil in the world, triggering this massive increase in prices and export revenues. And of course, this was, as we all know, this was paid for by essentially 20 years of declining price of oil, which first of all the countries in this region tried to contain by reducing exports, and then sort of started to live with and try to regain effectively market share, but by accepting a much lower level of oil prices. The massive spare capacity that emerged during this the 1980s, the time where they were cutting exports, this was progressively wiped out during the 1990s. And when it came to essentially zero, when global oil demand came and bumped until installed capacity in the Middle East, the price jumped again. And this is the red period in this graph, which culminates in 2011 with export revenue of roughly $700 billion. That's not exactly the case, because that's if you take the Brent price to make the calculation. Actually, the realized export price on average for this region is slightly lower, but not much lower. And the key question for me is this level of export revenue and export volumes where this region is now, does this correspond to a strategic choice or is it just an accident? Are those countries here because they chose it or because forces beyond their control put them here? And let's consider that, let's assume that this is a choice. If this is a choice, then it means that Middle East exporters, and especially the largest of them all, Saudi Arabia, thinks like Mr. Al-Khalifa and not as Mr. Al-Saban, essentially. That they think that there has been a significant change in the ability of both supply and demand to respond to price. Otherwise, the current levels of exports are going to be paid by 20 years of low prices and cutting exports. So what I just want to do as a thought experiment is to see if that's a sensible appreciation. I mean, is it really the case that what economists call the supply elasticity and the demand elasticity, the ability of the market to respond to price, would be much lower than they were 20, 30 years ago? Well, it is indeed possible. I mean, there's a case for that. The case for that has been made very elegantly in a few words by the previous speaker, and I will make it in a more messy way, with much longer way. But essentially, if you look at production of liquids outside OPEC, it has been going down for essentially 30, 40 years, from fairly high levels to nearly zero a few years ago. So despite the very high prices, until the North American unconventional revolution, the world oil industry outside OPEC had become incapable of growing, and in many oil provinces was actually shrinking. This is an environment which is conducive to high prices, indeed. The part of the slide that I can't see from here, but that hopefully you can see, is the North American revolution, where you see that at the current rate, at the current trend, the US crude production basically grows 1 million barrels per day. So if you put that back into the historical graph over there, you can see that just the US revolution, the US unconventional revolution, even if you don't take into account growth in the former Soviet Union and potential continued growth in biofuels, just the US would put us back to the situation where we were in the mid-1980s or even early 1980s in terms of non-OPEC supply. So basically there's what's happening in North America is extremely meaningful in terms of the ability of the oil industry to grow outside the Middle East and outside OPEC. At the same time, on the demand side, there's a historic shift in North America where what basically everybody thought was impossible is actually happening. You have a mix of people driving less and people driving more efficient cars. The average fuel efficiency of cars, which had been declining gradually but steadily for more than 20 years, has now completely shifted and abruptly shifted and is now improving steadily year after year, way beyond what is required by legislation. At the same time, people tend to drive less. They tend to, over time, live less far from where they work. They tend to cut on discretionary traveling. They tend to don't take the SUV to go and buy a bottle of milk, but maybe do more online shopping. And all millions of small decisions which actually make fairly big changes in US oil consumption. Plus, and that's only transport. What's not in this graph is what's happening outside transport, which is very impressive because of the price difference between oil and gas. Gas is displacing oil in all stationary usages at a fairly high rate and big time in industrial usages. So if the Middle East countries, to get back to my question, are where they are by choice, they are, this is a very risky strategy, let's say. However, well, that's the conclusion of that. If, they may have to cut exports again because they may have been too optimistic. So if they have to cut exports again, like they had to do in the 1980s, they will face two types of challenges, at least two types. One has been already covered, so I'm not going to spend time on it, is the severe fiscal and internal political pressure in most countries of the region, which will make cutting exports in an environment of falling prices very difficult. But there's also the geopolitical aspect, which is centered on Iraq. Iraq is ramping up in terms of production and exports at a rate that is actually higher, not higher than what the Iraqi ministry announced 2 years ago, but higher than what most independent experts thought would be possible. So it's been very quiet so far because the price of oil is so high that all the oil that comes to the market is actually very welcome, including from the point of view of other OPEC countries. However, if OPEC and Gulf countries find themselves in a situation where they have to cut exports in an environment of declining prices, the Iraqi story is going to become much more controversial. And you may see a very tense situation emerging between Iraq and Iran on export quota within OPEC, perhaps between Iraq and Saudi Arabia, and of course between the Kurdish region government, Kurdistan regional government, and Baghdad on the coordination, let's put it like that, of their respective expansion plans. So this could lead to geopolitical turmoil as well as internal political tensions. However, there's another scenario, and the other scenario is that there is an immense reservoir of demand in the developing world. The left-hand side graph shows you the per capita oil consumption for various countries. You've got the US on this graph. You've got 3 countries, the tigers from Asia, which developed in the previous decades, and then you've got China and India. China and India are both billion-plus population countries. with economies rising between 5 and 10% a year, depending on the country and on the years. And they are now at very, very low levels of oil consumption per capita. So even if they never catch up with, let's say, South Korea, but even if they catch up like 25% of the difference with South Korea, you're talking about a gigantic amount of oil demand that's added to the market. However, according to even some fairly optimistic projections, like the BP projections on the right-hand side of this slide, you can see that even if you're optimistic on North American unconventional supply, these type of models tell you that you will need to balance the market a significant increase in Middle East exports and Middle East production. Or you will have very strong price spikes that may kill economic growth worldwide. So could, in such an environment, the Middle East countries increase their exports if they have to? Well, I'm not quite sure. And this is a graph about that puts number on a challenge that has been mentioned by the previous speakers, especially Mr. Al-Saban, which is the fact that consumption growth in this region actually absorbs almost all the growth in production. So you see over time, the share of the growth in production, which is absorbed by internal consumption from these countries, has risen dramatically. And in the recent past, it's been basically everything. So if you want to expand exports meaningfully from this region, if the world market needs it, you would need both very significant levels of exploration and production investment, but you would also need to address in a very meaningful way the runaway growth in internal consumption. And these are huge challenges. So going back where I started, we're probably, well, I don't know if this region is here by accident or by strategy, but it's clear from what we've heard tonight, I think from the three speakers, that the future is, well, first of all, is unknown, but if the market becomes very, very tight, even tighter than it was in the past few years, this region may have great difficulty responding to the world supply by expanding its exports capacity. However, if the market becomes much softer than it was in the previous decade, this region may have difficulty cutting its exports because of both internal and regional political issues. So I think the challenges and the risks are clearly identified. How they are addressed is a matter for policymakers in the region. After all, they may be lucky, and they may not have to make all the difficult choices at the same time. They may have another decade to make them, but it's clear that the extremely good times that this region has known in terms of oil export revenues for now the better part of a decade are probably creating by themselves very significant strategic challenges for the region. Thank you.
Thank you, Pierre. I think those set of slides were absolutely stunning. Thank you for that presentation. I will now invite questions. Yes, sir. And I'll pick up 2 or 3 questions, come back to the panel, and then go back to the audience. Yes. Since we are recording this, it'll be useful if each of you can identify yourself.
Dr. Yusuf Bashar, businessman. When I have heard George W. Bush declare a new world order, I started thinking, what does that mean? And as an economist, I have never really liked geopolitics nor geoeconomics. But after his saying, I started liking it the most because it is really the actual word right now. The most surprising since 2003 onward, and the big shock that comes with the shale oil of the United States. We have never really heard this amount of energy could come in the United States. I believe the real problem of concerning future oil producing and whatever global competitiveness on oil, whether Middle East or other than Middle East, is above the surface, not underground. It is politics. And I always say, I wish our oil experts becomes politicians. They will understand much more of actually where we're going and how we are going. With all the geopolitics, geoeconomics that's going on right now within the Middle East, within Syria, within what we call the Arab Spring, within the increase of shale oil in the US, within the Nabucco pipeline that nobody's talking about, where are we going to be in the Middle East in 2020? Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, sir.
Thank you. My name is Herman. I'm from Indonesia. I'm standard of Indonesia in Bahrain. My question goes to Dr. Al-Sa'ban. And I think he first introduced the notion about the Saudi current energy consumption growth rate 7% annually. So my question is, this is based on the experience of Indonesia, because now Indonesia will become net importer of oil because the growth of the consumption is relatively high, and maybe the government not succeed in bringing reducing of the growth. So I don't know what will be in the future if the Saudi domestic consumption keep remaining 7%. Maybe the next 20 years becoming net importer, or I don't know. This is something that now Saudi is one of the biggest supplier of oil in the world. But considering that the consumption, or the growth of the consumption, domestic consumption is very high, I don't know. Is there any policy how to overcome this situation? Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. You have mentioned, Dr. Al-Sa'ban, that diversification is one of the solutions or the solution to the economy. But you didn't mention what kind of industry that you think that you're going to shift or you're going to move, and whether you have any competitive advantage to do that. Thank you.
Thank you. Yarmo Kartulani, EDB. One of the issues that was alluded to was the growing shift from oil to natural gas in stationary usage. To what extent are you, I don't know if worried is the right word, about the possibility of the oil and gas markets over time merging and that shift continuing also in non-stationary areas?
Why don't we just get a quick response from the panel, and then I'll come back to you. Dr. Saban, I think there's a question to you, but other panelists can.
Thank you very much. With regard to the question of our colleague from Indonesia, the 7% annual growth in the domestic consumption is very alarming. And the possibility of Saudi Arabia being a net importer is not there, because serious efforts been taken now. And we could be net importer if the status quo is prevailing. But with the kind of policies and measures that Saudi Arabia is undertaking on the demand side and on the supply side, I think gradually this high growth rate will be tapering off, and we will see lower demand for energy domestically, lower growth in the demand for energy, and at the same time supplies from non-oil energy sources will replace oil in order to free more oil for exports. And plus, there is the capability of increasing your capacity at any time. I mean, production capacity. Saudi Arabia always kept 2 million barrels, around 2 million barrels per day excess capacity. But this excess capacity could be increasing if we see that the domestic consumption is increasing at a faster rate than we thought. But we are very comfortable now that with the kind of policies being put in place, that we will be able to reduce our domestic consumption, and definitely will not be one day a net importer, to assure you. And we are not like Indonesia. Maybe you did not take your right decisions at the right time. No, I'm just with regard to the diversification, yes, well, the main goal for our diversification is, as I said, knowledge-based economy. But definitely, if we are to embark on industries and other sectors, surface sectors is a major sector that we can diversify our economy. Financial sector is another one, but also industry. Now we are going into the clusters, industries where we go downstream on the different petrochemicals, and also trying to utilize, for example, our mineral resources like phosphates. Now we are trying to increase the value added and not to export our minerals just simply as we did before, and try to build different industries. So I think industries, tourism, even tourism with regard to the religious tourism, you know that Saudi Arabia is the center of the Islamic world, where the two Qibla, the two places, the two holy places are being visited by millions of people annually. And I think that will generate, if we improve the services needed and the quality, that will generate a lot of revenues also. But so it is not only one thing that you can do in order to diversify, but the main thing is to have the Saudi individuals be well educated, that they can be creative, and that they can compete on international level with regard to their innovations, their creativeness, etc., etc.
So you are talking about the productivity, right?
Productivity, yes, basically.
And do you think that you will be able to compete with other nations?
Well, gradually, yes. What is the difference? Well,
Your country's too closed. If you want a knowledge economy, you need open exchange of ideas.
we
You
will.
need open borders. You can do the phosphates or
Yes.
the mineral resources downstream.
Yes, it will happen.
Unless you open your country up,
It-
you will not have knowledge.
It will happen, my colleague. It will happen definitely. It is, if you watch Saudi Arabia in the last 2 years, many things happen. Gradually, of course, it is slower than expected, but it is happening.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think maybe two questions could be relevant to answer. I'll start with the oil gas issue, which you pointed out. I think before the shale story, there was a trend that gas suppliers, Russia and Qatar and some of the oil majors, were pricing their LNG supplies in an oil index. So the convergence of the two were seen to be possible. I think what happened in the US changed that completely. The issue with gas is it's not as fungible as oil. Oil shipment is in the sea, it can be diverted anywhere, doesn't matter where it goes. It's a very liquid market, goes here or there, doesn't matter. Gas, the problem is to export it, there's a huge investment for liquefaction. And the cost overruns that are happening in Australia now, in the African continent, and in Sakhalin in Russia. And the supply contracts have to be long-term. And every ship leaving an export port is destined to go to that import port. It's not going to be as fluid a market anytime soon. Now, the supply will definitely increase by 2017. There could be a glut in the market, but it will never be close to what oil is today. So my personal belief is that the convergence is not really possible. Gas is a very difficult commodity to transport. You still don't have receiving terminals to give you enough buyers out there. I think that's my version of the oil-gas convergence issue. There was a question, I think, Dr. Michel, about what will the Arab world be by 2020. That's very, hopefully oil people will never be politicians, because if they do, you'll never have oil on the surface. It'll be exactly where it is. But we wish the region all the best. The pressing issue today is definitely Syria. I think the world community has to come together to put a stop to all the bloodshed, or else the results will not be good to anyone. And I think it requires everybody's efforts. But that's my version of geopolitics. I'd rather go back to becoming an oil person. So these are the two questions that I thought were relevant to myself.
Thank you. Pierre?
The only one I'm going to pick up is the one on oil and gas again. I think you're absolutely right. This competition of gas towards oil, and this displacement of oil by gas will reach transport, and is reaching. I mean, in the US, it is reaching transport now. The largest operator of railways in the US, which is an affiliate of Warren Buffett's holding, has announced a few weeks ago, maybe a couple of months ago now, that they were converting all their engines to LNG. So, you know, the CEO of Total said recently in a conference, I mean, that was before the price of gas moved up a bit in the US, but he said currently on a BTU basis, on a BTU for BTU basis, oil costs 6 times the price of gas in North America. And he said something has to give. I think he's basically right, you know, and things are changing. But what it means, well, first, I think there are two important aspects. One is, for now, it's a North American phenomenon. The price of gas everywhere else in the world is much, much, much higher than it is in North America. So the other thing to say is, as this takes place, both in stationary and increasingly, both in stationary usages and increasingly in transport, as this takes place, the price of gas will go up. And so the competitive advantage vis-à-vis oil is going to be eroded by market forces. In stationary usages, you may see coal come back against gas in a few years' time when the price of gas goes up and the price of coal continues to go down. So, you know, markets are dynamic. They adjust permanently. You're not going to see natural gas completely, you know, wiping out oil because, again, I mean, you know, a lot of the major investments in North American unconventional gas are not profitable at the level of prices that are currently the prices in North America. though prices have started to go up again a bit. But when Exxon bought XTO, I mean, they spent $31 billion to buy XTO, 4 years ago now? I mean, it was not on the expectation that natural gas would cost $2 per million BTU forever. I think, they have a much longer term view, and they very much expect that, especially because gas is going to displace oil in some usages. Over time, the price of gas will go up again.
Yeah. Yes, sir. I'll take a few more questions. If you can be brief, then we can take more questions and then get back to the panel.
Thank you very much. Dr. Nawaf Rumi, Ahliya University. By considering the supply and demand of oil with the non-conventional resources, we have to take into account the dependency of oil revenues in the national income of, for example, Middle East countries. If we talk about difference between Middle East countries when they exploit the oil under the desert and the North Sea oil, the difference between the production costs. Then we say something about supply and demand. When we talk about supply from Middle East, we cannot say that the same situation in Saudi Arabia it is in some other Gulf countries because of the age of the oil. What is the age? How many years the oil will be exhausted, and the dependency on the oil revenues. So the scenario of Mr. Noel, the second one, I agree with him that the second scenario with increasing the supply, as far as the West, they decrease the dependence on oil and depending on some other resources. So that means we are not going to see some kind of recession when the oil prices becomes about $7 a barrel, or some kind of high expansion of the barrel becomes about $140. So that means that even my friend said about the George Bush and the politics affect the balance of oil supply and demand. But we have to take into account that each country have separate policy of depending on oil. For example, the dependence on Nigeria on oil because they are a poor country, and the competition between North Sea oil. So that's what I want to say about the equilibrium between supply and demand in front of solar energy, non-conventional, and other resources. Thank you very much.
Yes.
My question is addressed to Dr. Noel. Nadeem Mushtaba, Director's Council. You mentioned about conversion in the developed economies context. In your scenario B that you had put in, the driving force was the break leaving Russia out, the Indias and the Chinas, where potential growth and demand could change the scenario. A lot of discussions are taking place in the Indias of the world with regards to conversion towards gas. Do you see that being a key factor or an important factor in your scenario B?
Thank you. Yes, at the back. I'll come to you. Yes.
Saud Khwaja from Falcon Petroleum. My question is same question to Sheikh Mohammed and also to Dr. Saban. We've talked about conventional and unconventional oil and gas. We all know that more than 90% of heavy oil is still untapped. And there is a certain quantity of heavy oil in Bahrain also. Could you, perhaps Sheikh Mohammed can tell us if there's any progress in development of heavy oil in Bahrain? Occidental has been very successful in doing this in Oman. And also, the only other area heavy oil has made progress is Khafji Joint Operation. I'd like to ask Dr. Saban to tell us if there's any push towards extraction of heavy oil in Saudi Arabia.
Thank you. Yes, sir. Yeah.
I have just a short question. Since you are talking about strategy, my question is that does really Saudi Arabia have a clear-cut strategy as where they're going to be, let's say, by 2030? Now, this issue of dependency on oil, still exists today as it's existed 50 years ago. If you look, for example, the contributions of oil to GDP and to the income revenues, Saudi Arabia today is still standing the same as it used to be 50 years ago. Now, the second question is related to the supply and demand for oil. Because if you look at the literature, today they tell you, and in the last 10 or 15 years, the most single important factor that influenced the prices of oil was basically demand and supply. We simply mean that demand and supply were the most important determinant of oil. Demand, of course, generated by the growth in China and India, other BRIC countries. And then on the side of the supply, as you just mentioned, only Saudi Arabia probably has a 2 million barrel capacity of supply. Any change in demand, of course, will lead to increase in prices of oil. Now, in the last few years, also, the supply of energy increased tremendously. And some of it you mentioned. And recently I was listening to an interesting lecture by the ambassador of India in Bahrain. And he came with a very interesting analysis by saying by 2030, the only two countries that will need each other's, Saudi Arabia and India, as far as energy is concerned. You see? And he made a rather very interesting assessment by saying the United States by 2017, they already indicated that they're going to be self-sufficient. Now, China and India are also learning how to conserve energy. And then now you mentioned gas and electricity and other factors, solar and so on and so forth. So all these must basically make some kind of changes on part of the policymakers in Saudi Arabia as to basically set the direction as where they're going to be in 2030.
Thank you, sir. I'll invite each of our panelists to take about 3 minutes each so that we can finish on time.
I hope it will not be India and Saudi Arabia that will need each other because we have more oil than India needs, and you have more people that would like to work in Saudi Arabia than we can absorb. But anyway, I think it is much larger than that. With the world of interdependency, I think we all need each other. The talk about energy independence in the US is something that may not materialize for some time. But even if they don't import any barrel from Saudi Arabia or from the Middle East, that doesn't mean that the importance of the Middle East will be minimized as long as the US imports some barrels from any part of the world because of the phenomena of fungibility of the oil market, where they need to be aware of what kind of prices that will prevail, and definitely the Middle East will have an say in that. As far as the supply demand, as you rightly said, well, I think I'll go back to my colleague who said that, well, was it a strategy or accidental? I think part of it was accidental because of the geopolitics nature lately, and because of the speculative element in the prices of oil in the last 5 years. I don't think Saudi Arabia and other oil producers would have loved to see prices above $100. They know that these high prices will impact the market share, their market share of oil. And definitely, and the clear example is that Saudi Arabia is basically producing at maximum, and other OPEC countries also producing at maximum. aside from the 2 million barrels per day excess capacity of Saudi Arabia, but we still see prices still above $100. So I think a barrel. I think a major part of what is happening is accidental. It is not a strategy, and it has never been a strategy of Saudi Arabia to have prices that high, that they know definitely for sure that this will impact its market share.
Yes, I'll answer the question about the heavy oil. Operating the onshore field in Bahrain is a joint venture company called Tatweer. It's a joint venture between Occidental Petroleum of the US, Mubadala of Abu Dhabi, and us, Noga Holding of Bahrain. And they've been piloting heavy oil. They've produced 14 API oil. And now the results have been quite successful. I think they claim that maybe 20 to 30% of the production could eventually be heavy oil. I think, yes, the Saudi Arabia again has also in the shallower areas like us a lot of heavy oil. And steam injection has worked extremely well in Oman. There's a field called Mkhezna where Occidental increased production from 10,000 barrels to 100,000 barrels a day by using steam injection. So that's my answer to that specific question. And you know quite a bit about us. I need to know who you are.
So you can hopeful that recovery of oil will be faster if you focus more on heavy oil instead of old field or wali field?
There are two different things. Both will have targets. And the old field still has a lot of oil in it. A little bit more challenging to get out, but there is still a lot of oil in the old field. But this will be an add-on, extra.
And what's the target year for achieving 75,000 barrels a day?
I can't tell you that.
Sorry, I don't think you identified yourself. Could you identify yourself?
Sorry?
Could you identify yourself?
Yes, my name is Saud Khawaja.
Okay.
I work for Falcon Petroleum.
Thank you. Oh, yes. Mr. Khawaja. Well-known person, so I should have recognized you.
Yeah?
No, just very, very quickly. Okay. My feeling, my personal feeling, is that the penetration of gas in China and India is only going to be very significant if there is a lot of domestic gas. I just don't see that they would make a key part of their energy strategy to become super reliant on an internationally traded gas market, which is perhaps security-wise more problematic than oil because it's less liquid, as we were reminded a few minutes ago. So there is a lot of industrial and policy interest for shale gas in China, as you know. The resource base is huge, but the resource base is also huge in Europe. And now we know, Poland, there's been a lot of drilling. It's been very disappointing. Will China disappoint, or will China be another very big success story on gas? I don't know, but this is, to me, what will decide whether gas is going to massively penetrate Chinese energy balance in the coming years. And I would say the same for India.
Well, thank you. I think delighted that we have been able to finish bang on time. Thank you for all those interesting questions. And of course, most importantly, thanks to our panelists for their very knowledgeable presentation. I have only one more person to thank, and that's my colleague Hassan. If he's in the room, will he raise his hand? There he is. Thank you for organizing this the event this evening. And thanks to all my other colleagues from the IISS. And of course, thanks to each one of you. Thank you very much.